Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. This video is about the last Empress of India. And there you can see behind me a statue. So she's wearing her robes of the Order of the Garter with a very lavish feather in her hat. So then you can see the royal coat of arms behind, and the lion is very cheekily sticking his tongue out at us. So they're a lion passant, as in walking past. Sorry, what am I talking about? Lion rampant, because he's on two legs. If they're on four, they're passant. She was born in Glamis Castle in 1900. That's in Scotland. Her father was the Earl of Strathmore. Her surname's Bowes-Lyon. So she came from a very distinguished aristocratic family whose lineage is traceable for centuries. She lived that typical lifestyle of being brought up by governesses and tutors and just being prepared for marriage. So she had a number of siblings. One of her elder brothers was killed in the Battle of Loos in Belgium in 1915. Then she got to know the Duke of York, and that's the future King George VI, who was the youngest son of the then monarch, King George V. And they married in 1923. So in 1926, that April, her first child was born, Elizabeth II, the current Queen, Elizabeth II, was born on Bruton Street in London, in a house that no longer stands, which is terrible. And the Home Secretary was supposed to attend all royal births, but Sir Joynson Hicks, he was outside the room at the vital moment. I'm not sure what the idea of the Home Secretary being there was. I suppose to certify, yes, this baby really was born to them. This is not an imposter. No supposititious infant smuggled in a warming pan, a la James II. That hoo-ha, that canard. And her second daughter, Princess Margaret, was born at Glamis Castle in Scotland. And the people were openly sexist in those days. There was a BBC newsreel about it, shown at the cinemas, saying the birth of a girl comes as a disappointment. The nation had prayed for a prince because her husband, in the Duke of York, she was the Duchess of York, and her husband's elder brother was Edward VIII. He was known as Edward VIII at the time. Of course, he was the Prince of Wales. It's very confusing because Edward VIII, his real name was, let me think, try and get this right. George Andrew, Christian Albert Edward Andrew Patrick David. And he was known as David within the family, his last name. Whereas George VI, he had several forenames, the first of which was Albert, known as Albert within the family, but when he became king, he reigned as George VI. So they both had George's forenames. If you think it's confusing, well, it is. Anyway, so she had two daughters and had no more children for the rest of her life. But cut a long story short, her father-in-law, George V, died on the 20th of January 1936, and he was more or less murdered by Lord Dawson of Penn, the royal physician, by giving him a fatal dose of morphine. I know he was almost dead anyway, but he just eased his passing as the royal physician issued a bulletin saying His Majesty's life is drawing peacefully to a close, and Lord Dawson of Penn even wrote down about the mortal dose of morphine that he'd administered to the king. So that was that, dying at Sandringham. Bugger Bognor, didn't want to go to Bognor Regis for a rest cure. So Edward VIII was king. Edward VIII, there he was, 42 years old and unmarried. He only seemed to ever have relationships with married women. So what was going to happen? Whereas George VI was a model of marital harmony. George VI, whatever else you say about him, he had a severe speech impediment, but he was faithful to the marriage bed. He was certainly a good family man, just wanted to be a naval officer, was not a man of vaulting ambition. Anyway, so then Edward VIII, he became involved with Mrs. Wallace Simpson, this American woman who was twice divorced, who was living here in the United Kingdom, and then he wanted to marry her because divorce proceedings had been begun. And that was the abdication crisis. Won't talk too much about it again. But finally, push came to shove and he said, all right, I'm abdicating. So therefore, George VI became king, which he hadn't expected. And he desperately did not want this. Greatness was thrust upon him, as Shakespeare would say. So the Duchess of York, that's the woman behind me, suddenly became the queen. So her name was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Not to be confused with her daughter, Elizabeth II. Because This woman here, she was a queen consort. She was only queen because she was married to a king, whereas the current queen, Elizabeth II, is a queen regnant. She is queen because she inherited the crown from her father, not because she married a king. So that was that. And in 1939, George VI and his wife, this lady here, they went on a tour of Canada and the United States, which is crucial as the war was looming. And Edward VIII went abroad. He assumed the title Duke of Windsor and Duchess of Windsor, and he was very miffed that his brother George VI would not grant his wife the handle Her Royal Highness as well. So they spent most of their time in Paris, also Château de la Croix on La Côte d'Azur. And the Second World War broke out, and Edward VIII, he later went to the Bahamas, but he was still adored by certainly a segment of the population. So the Queen and the King, they were here. War was declared, obviously. They had wanted to avoid that. There'd been appeasement. Remember when Neville Chamberlain had signed the Munich Agreement, he'd come back here in September 1938, been invited on the balcony of Buckingham Palace up the street to be lauded by the crowds. The nation breathed the collective sigh of relief. So anyway, she was certainly a woman of right-wing opinions. Some people might even accuse her of being having pro-Nazi opinions. Not sure about that. She seemed to believe in the inherent superiority of whites, and that's that. So that's why some people loathe her. Anyway, so the war broke out, and she had to be a stalwart figure. Now, so various other monarchs had gone to Canada, those of like Norway and the Netherlands and so on. Should she go to Canada? And she said, well, the children will never leave without me, I will never leave without the king, and the king will never leave, so they're going to stay in Buckingham Palace. Having said that, they were only there in the daytime. They went to Windsor Castle at night by car. And Hitler declared that when he conquered the United Kingdom, Windsor Castle would be his personal residence, which is why it was safe and it wasn't bombed. I'm not sure that the British authorities were aware of that. So she visited the East End to express her sympathies for those who've been bombed out. Buckingham Palace was bombed and slightly damaged, and as she said, I can now look the East End in the face. But they didn't live on rations. They lived quite well during the war, so I mustn't exaggerate what she did. And obviously she was on the balcony there at Buckingham Palace on VE Day when the royal family were adored by the jubilant crowd. So that was that. And her husband was ailing after the Second World War, had to save his strength for events where he felt the sovereign's presence was absolutely essential, and delegating to his eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, as much as possible. That's the one who's now Elizabeth II. And it was clear he was dying from cancer. He was a chain smoker. He was always a very lean man and was looking increasingly drawn and haggard as the year 1950 rolled around. So that's the one thing about, despite having the most sumptuous banquets for him, he ate but sparingly, whereas the Queen Mother, this woman behind me, was later known as the Queen Mother, she was on the chubby side. But so Elizabeth II was then heir presumptive. She couldn't be heir apparent because, of course, it was possible that her mother would suddenly be delivered of a boy who would trump her because, of course, boys took precedence over girls, and that's that. Some people say that they deliberately chose not to have children because they recognised the fantastic monarchical qualities of their eldest daughter, who was always very serious-minded and dutiful, and that they couldn't be sure that any son that they might bear would be quite up to the mark. Anyway, so 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham, her husband finally passed away, and that was that. He obviously had his state funeral, and Elizabeth II was then on tour in Kenya and was proclaimed queen, chose to go with her personal name, Elizabeth, not one of her middle names, Alexandra Mary. And so the current queen, this woman, not the current queen, the statue here, this woman Elizabeth, she became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, as in mother of Elizabeth II. To avoid the confusion, Elizabeth II is the woman who's queen now, and this one here, also named Elizabeth, was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Just call her the Queen Mother for short. Confusing, hey? So she'd been on a tour to South Africa in 1947, and she met some Afrikaners, and there's those Dutch-speaking South Africans, saying, I could never forgive the English for what they did to my country. And she quipped, we in Scotland often feel the same way. People often wrongly imagine that she was English just because she had an upper-class accent. So she was very old-fashioned, perhaps the last Victorian. Well, she was born in Queen Victoria's reign, seemed to not to mind the men philandering, but thought that ladies, certainly aristocratic ladies, had to be faithful and all the rest of it. So a bit perturbed to see that her younger daughter Margaret was involved with Group Captain Peter Townsend, who was divorced. And as we know, in 1955, it was decided that Princess Margaret wouldn't marry him. She could have married him, but she would have to have a morganatic marriage no longer have a civil list, and any children that she might bear would not be in line of succession. But Princess Margaret, I suppose, really cared about filthy lucre as well as her exalted status, and that's why she didn't marry for love. I don't think it was out of her duty to the Commonwealth and mindful of the indissoluble nature of Christian marriage. That's what Princess Margaret said in her statement as her reasons for not marrying this man. So she moved to, it was, my God, Clarence House, just hereby, if I got that right, and lived out the rest of her life there. And I saw her once in the year 2000 at Royal Ascot. I was only about 10 meters away from her, something to tell the grandchildren. I saw the last Empress of India. It's hard to believe that such a person ever existed. And so she was ailing in 2001, and in March 2002, her daughter, Princess Margaret, who was always fagging away, predeceased her. Quite plaintive moment, poignant for any parent to see their child predecease them, and the Queen Mother died shortly thereafterwards. So that's that. She is interred at Frogmore, the royal necropolis, on the grounds of Windsor Castle. They don't make them like that anymore. I was there to file past her sarcophagus at the Lying in State in Westminster Hall. So she was said to be a woman of very definite political opinions, to favour Ian Smith's regime in Rhodesia, that's Zimbabwe, and raise her glass when a politician's name was mentioned, higher or lower according to how highly or lowly she rated them, and was certainly an avid fan of Margaret Thatcher, but couldn't openly say so. And so many of her footmen and butlers, they were homosexuals because I suppose they were attracted to the livery and that sort of frippery and lifestyle. And so she supposedly said on the phone to them, "Will you queens bring this old queen a drink up here?" In case you don't know, in British argot we used to call gays queens. And one of the reasons for often employing gays in this position is obviously until 1967 their behaviour was a crime, and even after that was very much socially disapproved of. If they gave out any tittle-tattle about the royal family had the dirt on them to squash them. You know, if you behave, your behaviour will be ignored, but if you go bad-mouthing us, we can have you sent to prison. After that, not sent to prison, we can sack you and make it difficult for you to get many other jobs if you're publicly known to be gay. And behind her is a statue of her husband, George VI. Well, that is perhaps enough about the Queen Mother.